All right, good afternoon, everyone. It's 1:30 by my time, so we're going to get rolling here. So my name is Philip Mellon. We got attorney Matt Eichenlob here. About to start our June 2025 webinar on moving into a new home and security deposits. So we've got an hour and a half planned, about an hour for the presentation and 30 minutes for Q&A at the end. So here on behalf of Homeline, and we are a tenant rights organization. We have a hotline. You can see the number there, either the 612 area code, or you can call toll free. And we operate in 4 languages: English, Spanish, Somali, and Hmong, with different numbers for each one of those. And you can also email an attorney by going to our website, homelinemn.org/email, or you can just go to our website and go to the email an attorney tab and get started there. So before we get going here, just a few brief housekeeping notes. So this session is being recorded and it will be on our website in a few days for anyone to view afterwards free of charge. If you have a question, please drop it in the Q&A function rather than the chat. The chat can get kind of busy with links that are dropped throughout the webinar. So if you have a question, again, just use that Q&A and we're more likely to see it. And finally, 1.5 CLE credits are being applied for this session. General CLE credits. If you don't know what CLE is, don't worry about it, and congrats on making good life choices. And with that, I think Matt, it's your house.
Yes, thank you. Or, maybe you do need to know about the CLE and you're making bad life choices by not knowing about it. We just don't know what's going to happen with those CLEs. But I know if you're listening, you can get credit. So yes, my name is Matt Eichenlob. I'm one of the attorneys here at Homeline. And today I'll be talking about applications, things to look for in applications, the rules surrounding applying and receiving applications for rental. And we'll talk about security deposits. I think those two things really go hand in hand. They're sort of the preliminary things that a tenant does and a landlord does before entering into a contract, really talking about, is this tenant suited for me? Is this landlord suited for me? And then getting that, preliminary security deposit paid. And then what are those rules? So yeah, we got an hour and a half and we've got a fair amount of material. So let's get into it. Here's our agenda. Part 1 is going to be finding a home. And part 2 will be security deposits, just like I said. So let's go. I don't know if I'm on this or not. I'm really not great at technology of all sorts. All right. So finding a new home. Of course, this is what you're doing here, right? A tenant is looking for a place to live. A landlord is looking for a tenant. And, when they find each other, a contract happens. And maybe that's as close as we have to magic these days, is the magic of contracts. I think what we need to start first talking about are the types of tenancies out there. These are just sort of basic terms. You may remember them from law school. You may not have gone to law school, and these things just sort of get thrown around. I'm not sure, but it's good to get the vocabulary out of the way. The first type I'll talk about is going to be the tenancy at will. This is sort of the informal tenancy. We see these happen when there is not much of an agreement, where it is an informal situation where I might say to my brother, yes, Eric, rent my back bedroom, $500 a month, pay me on the first. He says, yes, we've got ourselves a contract. We've got a tenancy at will. There's no set end date. It's a tenancy that renews itself automatically until one party gives the notice to vacate. The other time we often see these tenancies at will is at the end of a fixed term or periodic tenancy, where neither party gives any notice to vacate and the tenant just remains in the premises. So speaking of the periodic tenancy, that's what we're talking about, is a fixed term lease, right? A year lease. A tenant often moves into the property and will sign a year lease to start with. It's a contract. It's a promise to continue the relationship for a year or 6 months or 3 years or whatever it is. And that's the deal. It may become a tenancy at will. That depends on what happens at the end of the contract. Like I said, if the parties give the notice to terminate, then it ends. If nobody gives a notice, most of the time the lease continues forward under the old terms. How much rent is owed, can you smoke, can you have pets, when is rent due, right? All those rules carry forward, but on a month-to-month basis. on a lease that could be ended by giving the proper notice from either party. So those are good things to look for in a lease. What to look for in a rental? Um, you're going to have to do a lot of thinking about what you want. And, the more you want, the more prices are going to vary, right? That's going to depend on location, 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 as they say. And so you've got to kind of decide, what you're interested in. How much is your budget, right? Um, if you're, the general recommendation is you spend about a third of your income on your housing costs every month. So that can be a guideline for what price you're looking for. Price fluctuates depending on neighborhood. What's included in the price, right? How many bedrooms will there be? Um, I think there's sort of some sort of equation you have to do in your head, right? You may find one place that says it's, $1,000, all utilities included. Another place might be $800. Tenant pays all utilities. Well, what's the better deal, right? We're not sure. Maybe it depends how warm you like to keep the apartment in the winter, I guess, right? That could be something that affects it. How often are you charging a cell phone? I don't know. Um, but you want to look at the price. You want to look at what's included. How many bedrooms are you getting? Sometimes it's worth it to think about it in terms of square footage when comparing property to property. Um, are pets allowed, right? You want to make sure that the place that you rent is going to fit your lifestyle. Are you a quiet person? Do you like to go out? Do you want a place where people are all over the place? Do you have pets? Is this a pet friendly place? Um, do you like to smoke, right? If you like to smoke, you don't want to rent a non-smoking place necessarily, right? So you want to make sure that you know what you're getting when it comes to applying for a place. You're applying to a place that you want to rent that will work for you. And where to look? Well, that's a good question too, right? Of course, you want to look near your job. That's convenient for your lifestyle, near your family, or maybe not near your family. I don't know your family. It depends, right? But near those community resources that you want. Um, and how is it for transit, right? That's something you can relatively easily look into to see, if I don't have a car or I don't like to drive, will it be easy for me to get to work, to the shopping market, to visit friends? If I'm taking a bus or I'm taking light rail, or is this a place that is really sort of on an island as far as public transportation is concerned? But all those things you want to research, and all of those things are going to weigh into whether or not this is a good place worth applying to, or a place that is not going to work out for you. Uh, and that's my feeling on that slide.
Yeah, Matt, real quick, if I can jump in.
Mm,
So
yeah.
I've linked two statutes in the chat, the
Mm,
non-optional fee statute and the declawing and
mm.
devocalization. If you just want to talk about this for a little bit.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. Yeah. Declawing devocalization, I think that's an important statute that was passed a few years ago. Basically says landlords cannot require cats or really I think any animals to be devocalized or declawed. That's those sorts of things have gone out of favor in the modern world, probably for good reason. I think for good reason. So be on the lookout for things that include that, for lease clauses that say that. Um, we're going to see as we go through this, there is room in the contract, there is room in the leases for the parties to set what rules, what regulations, what sort of areas of the agreement they want, right? There are some areas that are open to negotiation, that are open to individual preference, and there are some areas that are not. Something like, we're not going to talk about late fees, but something like a late fee, the statute caps it at 8% of the overdue amount. That's it. You can't go any higher, right? You certainly go lower, but some things are simply forbidden under statute, and the pet devocalization decline, that's one of them. That is sort of that's set out. The I think of the statute sort of as like kind of guardrails, right? We're not really here to talk about my theory of law or magic of contracts, though, are we? So let's talk about the fees, the second statute you pointed out. Um, this is something that is interesting to me because we saw it happen over the years. I've been here at Homeline for 17 years, and so I've sort of seen the market ebb and flow and change with time. And One thing we saw sort of welling up was extra fees that landlords would charge. It would be sort of an administration fee or a monthly service fee or a amenity fee, just a fee for the sake of a fee, basically, right? These sort of non-optional fees that the tenant has to pay no matter what. What this fee statute says is that a landlord can charge these fees, but any non-optional fees have to be advertised, and in the lease, they have to be included on the front page of the lease, and it has to be the final price that shows the total cost of the rent, all fees included. This is sort of an openness requirement, right? Um, we were seeing a lot of times a tenant would go to sign a lease. It was being advertised at $900 a month, but once all the non-optional fees got added in, now it was $1,250. That's not what was advertised. What was advertised was 900. So here, what we're saying is name the price. The price is the price, right? Don't go tacking things on at the end. I think it's good for everybody to have the price be open. That's how markets work best, when prices are in the open. Listen to me making an economic liberalism Adam Smith type argument here. How about that? I contain multitudes. Maybe I do. Okay. But as much as 16th, 18th century economic theory entertains us all, let's talk about something even more fun, and that's scams. Scams are even more fun. Um, we hear about a lot of rental scams, and this sort of goes into our application area, right? Because you want to be aware of these scams. You want to see them when they're happening. You want to see the red flags when they're being waved and acknowledge that they're red flags. Um, why do we see scams in the rental world? I think fundamentally a scam preys on hope and preys on desperation. I think that's what it is. And when someone is looking for a place to live, they are desperate. You have to be out. It's the 18th, right? 12 days from now is the 30th. If you don't have a place lined up, you got 12 days to figure it out, right? That's a lot of desperation. And so it goes with hope also as a counter to that. And that's when unscrupulous individuals can happen. So what to watch out for scams? A vague listing. I think if you're advertising your property, you've got, I don't know how many even words you have on Craigslist or Facebook Marketplace, 1,000, 10,000 words. Someone who just says 2 bedroom. It's kind of weird, right? None of these are necessarily dispositive of a scam, but they all sort of pile up into this might be a scam, right? Landlord won't meet you in person. Sometimes there's a very good reason why they won't meet you in person, but sometimes they're, someone who lives in Bulgaria and has an internet connection, and we just don't know that they've ever been to Minneapolis or could find it on a map, right? Or Ohio. It could be Ohio they live in. It could be somewhere else. Won't show the unit for rent. I think it's just good business to show the unit that the tenant is going to rent. Landlord's got a right to enter the property to show to prospective tenants. I would want to see what I'm buying. If we're talking about $1,000 a month times 12, that's $12,000. That's a huge amount of money to spend on anything. I think that's my opinion. And so, yeah, I don't think I would spend $12,000 on a car sight unseen. I'd want to take her for a test drive, right? So I'd want to see the unit that's actually for rent. Cash payments, cash only. That could be okay, but I don't know. I always say this: words are wind, right? They come out of my mouth and they just disappear into the air. Well, that's the same as cash, right? It's just gone. You got to get a receipt as a tenant. That's extremely important. If you're going to pay cash, I prefer personal checks for a lot of different reasons. But yeah, insisting on cash only, insisting on no written lease, right? Yeah, just give me the money and you can move in, no problem. No, these feel funny. The scam that we saw a few years ago was on Facebook and Craigslist, all these online marketplaces, and it usually involved a house. It looked nice and it was priced a little bit low, not remarkably low, but a little bit low. And the person posting the ad would say, this is house for rent. We are good Christian missionaries and we're going to go on our mission trip for 2 years and we want to rent this place and we're not looking to make a bunch of money. We just need somebody there while we're doing, the good work of the world. And so let's talk about it. And they will end up, getting the prospective tenant to send the money. Yes, you'll have the keys when the lease starts. The person who knows where they are, who knows what they're doing, but the money's gone and they never had the keys and they never owned it in the first place. And maybe it's not even their house. Maybe it's even owned by someone else. It usually is owned by someone else. Maybe someone's living there, right? So you just want to be careful. And the big thing is if it sounds like a scam, if it feels a little scammy, if it sounds too good to be true, well, it probably is. What remedy do you have if you fall prey to a scam? Good luck. I guess you can sue the scammer, but good luck if they're in, I don't know, why am I picking on Eastern Europe, Albania? I don't know. I guess they could easily be in, like I say, Minnesota. They could just as easily be in Isanti County or Hennepin County, I suppose, for that matter. But okay. So, we got a question. Should we do this question? Um, yes.
Yeah, I was gonna hold them till the
Oh,
end,
yeah.
at Q&A time, but
Yeah, no problem. Yeah.
okay. So we've got one in the Q&A.
Hmm.
That's probably worth talking about. So the question is, what about the listings where they are just looking for rental application fee scams, and online listings?
Okay. Oops, I was moving one of the things and now it's all over the place and I can't see anything except the, okay. Yeah. Yeah, what about when this is sort of the question is what about when landlords are just trying to collect application fees?
Yeah, so the way I've typically seen it done is like you go on Craigslist, you go on Facebook Marketplace, um, it's a listing, and they'll want to do like a 20 or $30 deposit to like
Hmm.
show that you're serious about the place, and they just do this all day, right?
Yeah.
So what are sort of like the indicators for those types of scams?
I mean that's going to be a lot of the same ones here, right? It's going to be sort of these vague listings. It's going to be an unwillingness to show the place. Uh, I mean, I guess I'm a little hesitant to pay money up front if you're not actually meeting the person, right? I think it's money up front before I even see the place. I think it's one thing to show me the times I've paid pre-lease deposits. I've toured the place and then paid the pre-lease deposit while they waited for the application to get processed. Um, because I'm seeing what I'm paying for in that situation. This notion of like, pay me some money and then I'll show it to you. I mean, that feels very scammy to me and very sort of I don't know if that's worth the chance to take on that one. Um, so I always recommend doing some homework. We're going to talk about applications and what process a landlord can run to screen a tenant, to run a tenant's application. Um, a tenant, you could certainly tell the landlord, look, I want to charge you an application fee to do a background check on you. And the landlord will laugh. They'll have a very good laugh, maybe the best laugh they've had that week. So good luck trying to get them to do it. But you can still do your own sort of screening. You can Google somebody, anybody, anything. You can Google anything and you'll find some answers. You'll have to evaluate them, right? Is this a credible person? Are there a lot of good reviews? Are there a lot of bad reviews, right? That's its own sort of thorny bush to get through. Um, but you can check court records. That is free and open court records. You can find out, has somebody had a lot of conciliation court claims filed against them? Has this landlord filed a lot of eviction actions? Have people had to sue them for rent escrow cases? What is going on with this? How is this person conducting business? You can ask around, right? It's a free country. You can talk to anybody. Knock on the doors of the neighbors. Ask them, hey, what's going on with this property? Um, you can come back and ask the tenants themselves, hey, what's going on? Why are you moving? How is this landlord? Um, that's all perfectly fine and allowed. And you'll find out the story, right? Talking to neighbors, you'll learn the story pretty quickly. Um, so that's some of the homework you can do. There's some other community organizations out there that may be able to offer some more insight. Um, Housing Link, That's a website that has some housing resources on it. Volunteers of America, Amicus, those are two organizations that have a lot of resources for finding places and know a lot about landlords. Same with Catholic Charities. So I think those are ways you can do sort of your due diligence. As a tenant, you're evaluating risk, right? You're paying this rent every month. The expectation is the landlord will make the repairs, will respect your rights to privacy, right? Will conduct themselves in a legal and reasonable fashion. And the risk you're taking is, I'm paying you this money. Are you gonna? And risk is a difficult thing to analyze. It's a difficult thing to evaluate. And that's all you can do is take in the information and decide, how risky is this? And is this risk something I'm comfortable with? And go into it with your eyes open as best you can. So we talked a little bit about this earlier, how much to budget for rent. Um, like I say, most financial resources, most financial advice organizations will say 1/3 of your income to rent. That can be a tricky amount because that's, in this rental world, in this rental market, it seems prices only go one way, and that is up. And I don't necessarily know if wages have been keeping pace, but I have my suspicions. And so you've only you got your pie. Your income is your pie every month, and rent is the biggest slice most of the time. At a third, that's usually going to be your biggest bill every month. So you want to make sure that it's something you can afford. If you overextend yourself, um, bumps in the road are going to hit a lot harder. It's going to be easier to fall behind. But again, just find a place that's a third of your income. Easier said than done, Matt. Thanks for the advice. Right? Impossible. Great advice, impossible to do. But that's sort of the guideline you want to think about. Again, you want to look at those utilities. Who pays what? How does that factor into the total price that I'm paying every month? Fees, again, got to be disclosed. Um, the lease is the lease. When you sign the contract, that's it. That's what's locked in. You don't have to agree to change it at all. And if the landlord forgot to add something or the tenant forgot to ask for something, um, no is a complete sentence in that situation. We wrote down 900 a month, but really we charge 950 for this. So we want to charge you 950. No, 900 is what was offered. 900 was what was accepted. It's too late to start adding fees into the lease after it's signed. So you want to keep an eye on that. I say that the lease is locked in, but also, right, leases are agreements. Agreements can be changed. It's really up to the parties to decide, do I want to change this or do I not want to change this? We're all adults here. If everybody agrees to change, that's just fine. Get it in writing. That's my key there. And you've always got the right to say no. The deal I signed is the deal I want. So roommates, what if? So what if I can't afford this place? What if it's just too much and I'm priced out of the rental market? What you're looking at is finding a roommate. And that can be good. It can be bad. It can be a neutral situation. But it's cheaper to split things in two, especially if you compare the price of a one bedroom versus a two bedroom. You see that there is a discount in volume, I suppose, on the two bedroom. Um, but they come with their risk. Um, each roommate is responsible for the full amount of the rent. If it's $1,000 and I pay my 500, but Philip doesn't pay his 500, I'm in trouble. I got to come up with Philip's half, or else the landlord evicts us both. So when it comes to picking a roommate, I will get into this in the application screenings. Um, I tell people you want to think a little bit like a landlord. You want to think about your roommate and, do they have good credit? How likely are they to pay back a bill if they have it? Um, are they likely to keep a job? Are they someone who gets fired a lot, right? Um, how does their lifestyle match up with yours? Are they interested in having a lot of people over? Are they more sort of quiet types? Um, because you're responsible for your roommate. If your roommate throws a wild party and the cops get called, um, that's a you problem. If your roommate violates the terms of the contract, the landlord can evict everybody. If your guests show up and cause problems, landlord can evict everybody. If your roommate's guests, the friends of your roommate, cause problems, that's your problem. So, you're going to be responsible for your roommate. You're really hitched together going forward. So, yeah, that's a tough decision to make, but oftentimes a necessary one. So, what do we need to apply? Most landlords will ask for some sort of identification, some sort of driver's license, state ID card. And they'll usually want a social security number or a individual taxpayer identification number. They're looking for income verification, right? We talked a little bit about the risk a tenant is evaluating for, right? Will the landlord make the repairs? The risk the landlord is evaluating for is, will the tenant pay on time every month? That's the number one thing. And how will they evaluate that risk? Income verification, right? Do you make one third of the three times? Do you make three times the rent? Is your income one third? Whatever it is, right? Three times is what they're looking for. They want to verify that. Maybe they'll want pay stubs or something like that. Maybe they'll want credit numbers, right? A credit check to decide, the credit score. It's sort of a way to try to evaluate how likely someone is to pay back a debt. I don't think it's that great. I have a lot of issues with it, but that's what they'll use it as sort of shorthand for. Um, will this tenant pay me every month? Because from the landlord's perspective, obviously, if they don't get paid, that's bad business for them. But letters of reference can be helpful if the tenant has maybe some bad things on their background, criminal history or rental history. That may be something worth asking for as well, or providing. A statement explaining what a landlord will find. I think this is good to talk about. Um, there is no hiding in the modern world. I think if we think about 100 years ago, 120 years ago, a person could just leave. They could just leave and go across the country and take on a new name and say they lived somewhere they never lived and just be a new person. And who would know? You've got cash, right? That's how things were back then. Hope you never see somebody from your old town. But that's not life right now. It hasn't been the situation for a very long time. There is no faking your life now, faking your death and taking on a new life. We don't do that in 21st century. Everything stays with you. Criminal histories, evictions, credit histories. There's just all a line, and there's no hiding it. And so I think that if you know something is on there, you've got a criminal record, you've got an eviction record, I think you want to be willing to tell the landlord, this is what you're going to find. It happened a while ago. Here's what happened. Here's what I've done since then, because they're going to find it.
All right, we've got one quick question here in the chat that's relevant here. Talking about letters of reference. Letters of reference from who, previous landlords, friends, etc. Who do you recommend?
Um, Previous landlords, I think, are great. And if you're honestly, this comes a lot to sort of, we hear about social network and networking and all these things, right? And it's not what you know, it's who you know is something that gets thrown around a lot. I mean, hey, my feeling is if you got a landlord willing to write a personal reference for you, that's great. Um, but also maybe they've got an open unit. If they're willing to go so far as a good reference, maybe they'll rent you again, right? It's always about asking. You never know who you know. You never know whose uncle will do something for you solid, right? So a former landlord, I think that's great. A social worker, I think that's great. Priest, I think that's great. A nun, I think that's great. I think, you know, all of these people who can be helpful in these letters of references.
Yeah, so I'll also throw in my 2 cents here. So my
Mhm.
general way of break it down is there's personal references and then there's professional references. And I always advise people to stay away from personal references like friends, family members, and people who have sort of a more personal interest in your well-being as a person. If that's all you can get, great, but they should be sort of a second tier. Your first tier is like employers, Like previous landlords are great, but someone who has sort of a less personal interest in your well-being, or sort of your strongest references, um, because there's just sort of the lack of the personal connection there.
Yeah, that's right. It'll come off as more objective, and that's what you're looking for. Yeah. Um, okay, application fees. Um, yes, so we're talking about all this tenant screening. Um, Landlords can charge for it. Usually, they charge to pay a service to do the screening fee. They are allowed to charge an amount to cover sort of the office time that goes into it. Um, but there are some regulations. If the landlord is going to charge money for the application fee, then they have to be upfront about what they are going to screen for. This is again about fair warning here, right? If the landlord's going to take a fee, they have to provide the tenant with a list of reasons why they will or won't be accepted, right? Criminal history this old, credit score this high, right? Evictions no more than this long ago, right? So that the tenant can evaluate it, right? These screening fees are not cheap. They might be 20, 35, $50 to run one of these things. And so the landlord needs to provide this criteria in writing so the tenant can know, will I be accepted or rejected before I pay this money? If the tenant is rejected for one of those reasons that was set forward clearly in writing, well, tenant, you're out the money. The landlord told you why you weren't going to be accepted. You applied, you took your chances, you lost. What did you expect, right? It's tough, but that's life. If the tenant is rejected for a reason that is not listed, they're entitled to their money back. Again, the rationale here is if you would have said landlord, I wouldn't have applied, but you didn't, so I did. How am I supposed to know the money should come back? So um, that's an important thing. If you're going to have criteria, and as a landlord, I think you should have criteria. I think it's good to have a set of criteria for what you will and won't accept as tenants, and you want to stick to it. I don't think it's. I think you might run into problems making exceptions here and there, but have your criteria, be upfront about it, and follow the statute.
All right, so real quick, just hopping in with another question that was in the chat. So tenant was promised that their record would not stop their ability to rent. They were denied for the thing they said they wouldn't be denied for, and they still want to keep the application fees. So sort of what are the remedies there in that case?
Yeah, the remedy is going to be to file in small claims court. Tenant can sue for the return of the application fee, as well as the filing fee and the and some extra penalties. I think it's $100 extra penalty the tenant can sue for. It doesn't seem like a lot, but that's a fairly easy case to prove. Here's the criteria. Here's the money I paid. Here's what the landlord said. Um, the other thing is it's a real pain for landlords to go to court, and so sometimes simply the threat is enough to get them to pay. But also filing, it's $75. It's not the most expensive thing in the world. Filing fee can be waived depending on income as well. There are penalties for lying on an application. The landlord can seek out $500 in extra damages if the tenant is lying on an application. It could be a crime depending on where you're applying. It could be grounds for an eviction after a tenant signs a lease. So um, don't lie on an application. That is my advice. So again, what does a landlord look for when it comes to evaluating for a tenant? Again, this is all about risk mitigation here for the landlord, right? They're trying to find a tenant who is going to pay on time, is going to be there for the term of the contract, maybe longer, is not going to all of a sudden disappear in the middle of the night for any number of reasons. So income is number one. That can be proof of income. That can be a credit score situation, um, criminal background. A lot of landlords do not want to rent to tenants who have criminal backgrounds or have very recent criminal history. Some landlords will make sort of a distinction between property crimes versus people crimes. Things like, the vandalism or, some sort of theft will not be viewed as serious as something like a sexual assault or a whole bunch of restraining orders or something like that. So that's something to consider. Um, A lot of landlords will consider how old a crime is, right? Oh, this happened. This was a misdemeanor and it happened 2 years ago. Okay. Oh, you're 23, you're 24, and you had a minor consumption when you were 20. Okay, right? Oops, among us, right? So those sorts of things are going to can weigh into it. But again, depending on how old, how severe, some landlords may be willing to look past that. Other things the landlord is going to look at is rental history. We used to talk to a lot of high school students, and what I would tell them is the landlord doesn't know you. They've never met you before. And so how will they predict how you will act in the future? Well, they'll look at what you've done in the past. And an eviction, you didn't pay a landlord rent and they had to file an eviction action against you. Yeah, landlords don't like that. It might be me next time, they'll think. So they'll be looking for evictions filed against you. They'll be looking for gaps in rental history. What happened here, right? They'll be looking at credit history. Low credit score is, maybe less likely to pay you've had some unpaid bills or some things have gone to collections, or, maybe you just don't have a lot of borrowing power. That's part of it too, right? No credit history, that can be a problem also. Sort of an unknown is not good for a lot of landlords. In business, an unknown is almost as bad as knowing something's bad. So you want to be aware of those things. And if they have criteria for these, you want to see some numbers, right? Saying something like, a tenant must have an appropriate credit score. Well, what's that mean? Appropriate? Give me a number, right? 650, 550. I don't know. Put a number on there. Appropriate. That's weasel word. I'm a lawyer. I know something about weasel words. All right, so back into it. Enough sidebars, Matthew. Um, so this is what happens next, right? You find the place, you apply for the place, you get accepted to the place. Next up is the lease. And leases, by and large, are either oral or written. I guess that's pretty much it. Um, the key thing is that it's an agreement to rent a piece of real property, to live there and pay money in exchange to stay there. There are a lot of leases out there. I like things in writing. This is me being a lawyer. I like to see it in writing because then we know what it says, and our memories are flexible and not always very accurate. But certainly, like I said earlier with my younger brother, an oral contract, that can be a contract too, but I do like in writing. Average lease is like 30 pages. I've seen some really long ones. And it's remarkable how little they say over the course of 70 pages. It's really just remarkable. But that's up to the landlord. Mostly it's the landlord who provides the lease. So you want to take a look at it. You want to understand it. Electronic leases are fine. This is the modern world we live in. State law protects tenants on a lot of different topics. That is a whole other CLE, probably 4 months from now. Who knows what that CLE topic will be? But you just want to make sure you understand the lease as a tenant. So the main things you want to double check when you're sitting down at that lease signing. How long is it for, right? Is this what we talked about, right? This is really double checking. Is this what we talked about? We talked about a year. Is this for a year? Who can live there, right? If someone is living there who is not on the lease, that could be grounds for an eviction action. So you want to make sure everyone who's on the lease, everyone who is living there is going to be on the lease. Is the rent correct? They advertised this amount. Is that the amount that's being reflected? Are the fees accounted for? That's all important stuff. How do you pay the rent? That's something that the parties can decide for themselves. More and more, I'm seeing landlords insist on only electronic payments, things through like Zelle or things through like whatever. There's 100 different rent cafe. That's one, right? And so that's if the parties agree to it, then they agree to it. There isn't sort of this overriding right to pay with cash or gold bullion or whatever, right? So be sure that that's something you agree with. Are pets allowed? That's something that's important, right? If you have a dog, you make sure you want to be able to have the dog. And what are your responsibilities as the tenant? What utilities are you agreeing to pay, amongst other things? So again, that everything lines up with what you saw in the ad, with what you talked about on the tour, with what you emailed about. You want to make sure that the lease is correct. A word about late fees. Um, again, I mentioned this earlier. They need to be in the lease. There are some rules about late fees that need to be followed under statute. 8% of the overdue amount. That's the limit. That's the cap. Um, the old rule was a lot more complicated. I like this rule because it's just mathematics. It's $80 on $1,000 rent. It's that simple. Um, so it's got to be in writing. It's got to be in the lease. 8% of the overdue amount. That's it, and that's all. It's worth noting that the rent can be late, even though the late fee hasn't been charged yet. This is sort of splitting hairs here a little bit, but I do hear it a lot. Um, I was never late. I always pay the late fee, so I was never late. Well, that's not exactly it. If rent is due on the first, late fee is owed on the fifth, and you pay on the third, hey, that rent is late. What can the landlord do about it? There's a lot of different things, but if it's owed on the first, it's owed on the first, and if it's paid after, it's late. But again, those dates are sometimes different with the late fees. So you just want to be aware of that when you're signing a lease. Okay, and moving in. So this starts with the security deposit, right? The security deposit starts on day one of the tenancy. For a lot of tenants, this means starting to play defense on day one on the security deposit. The landlord's required to do a move-in inspection. I think it's good to take pictures. It's good to have the landlord there. You could schedule this inspection. That's something that's required, but it's good to have pictures also. Everybody's got a cell phone. Everybody's got a camera on the cell phone. The old days, you could take pictures and you'd have to wait, 7 days to get them developed to see what they showed. That's not the case anymore, right? You can just take pictures and store them, to the cloud right up there in the sky. And when you move out in a year or 4 years, well, you've got them. Because what you're doing as a tenant is you're building a record to show, here's what it looked like when I moved in. Here's what it looked like when I moved out. And Your Honor, I've met my burden, especially if this place is a pigsty. I moved into some pretty horrible places. I've left some places pretty dirty too, but I moved into some really dirty places, and I didn't take pictures because I left them dirty. I got charged a lot of deposits, rightfully so. Maybe that's all part of growing up. I don't know, but look, it is important. This was one of them. In the bathroom, there was the toilet, and right next to it was the sink, and there was a drawer that came out of the sink. And so I was kind of, wiping it down as I was moving in. That wasn't that bad. But I opened up that drawer right next to it, and it was full of cigarette butts and ashes. Whoever had lived there before had just used this as their ashtray, their morning ashtray. So it was really gross, really disgusting. And that's the kind of thing you want to take pictures of when you move in, if there's something like that. So yeah, it's good to have a witness. It's good to have the pictures. It's good to have the videos. They're easier than ever to store, and everybody's got a camera with them nowadays. So that's important. And like I say, that takes us to security deposits. How are we doing? 12, 14. That's terrific. Let me take some more water here. So I think about security deposits as an insurance policy for the landlord. It's money they take upfront to pay for damages that might happen in the future, to pay for money that might be owed after the end of the tenancy. It's risk mitigation, is what it is. There's generally no statewide law that limits security deposits. Some cities limit deposits to being equal to 1 month's rent. I see it sort of all over the place. Some landlords will have something spelled out that says, well, if your credit score is this low or you've had evictions this recently, then your security deposit will be 1.5 a month's rent or something like that, right? As a tenant, that can be a way you can negotiate to get a hesitant landlord to rent to you, right? Hey, look, I'll pay you double deposit, right? That's more money in case, right? These are all things that can sort of be flexible in a way. But most landlords do require some sort of security deposit to, again, to pay for problems after the end of the tenancy. So here is sort of a chart that talks about Minneapolis. They have probably the strictest rental laws in the state, um, but they do have some rules on how much of a security deposit you can charge. Um, and here you can see in the case of monthly rent, you're capped to charging an amount equal to 1 month's rent. Um, Philip, why don't you take us through this chart? I forgot what it says.
Okay, yeah. So the way it works is if there's no prepaid rent, so right, if they don't require like last month's rent, the security deposit is capped at 1 month's rent, right? So in this example, tenant's monthly rent is $1,000, and so the security deposit is capped at $1,000. You can see in the second column, can't charge $1,100 because it's more than the monthly rent amount. Um, However, if there's prepaid rent and that's capped at no more than twice the rental amount, then the security deposit is capped at half of the monthly rental amount, right? So in this scenario, tenant pays $2,000 upfront in prepaid rent, and their security deposit is capped at $500. And then you can see in the last column, right, prepaid rent again, but the landlord is trying to follow the law and say, or interpreting the law differently and saying we're also going to charge a full $1,000 for the security deposit. Can't do it if you're charging prepaid rent is capped at half of the rental amount.
Yeah, I think that's good to talk about the prepaid rent also, because that's another way landlords can try to mitigate their risk, right? They're worried about a tenant running out on them without paying the rent, charge more upfront, right? Maybe that's charging the last month in advance. Maybe that's charging the first 2 months in advance. But that's going to really depend on a landlord by landlord situation. And so in Minneapolis, yeah, if you're going to charge more upfront, there's going to be sort of this leveling out, rebalancing of how much of a deposit you can charge. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, and then St. Paul is pretty similar. And the only difference is they don't have the cap based on prepaid rent, right? So columns 1 and 2 are the same. Security deposit is capped at 1 month rent. But if they also charge prepaid rent, they're not capped at that half of the rental amount. They can do the full month's rent on top of it.
Yeah, and these are good specific city laws to talk about because these are really the two largest rental markets in the state. Um, so at move out, what can be done about the deposit? It's good to mention that deposits gather interest. 1% non-compounding simple interest is what a landlord can charge. That's been 1% since as long as I've been at Homeline for 17 years and maybe even longer than that. Um, yeah, $1,000 gets you $10 a year. That's not added into the principal. It's just set aside every year. Another common question is what happens when the property changes hands? In that case, the old owner, the deposit must be returned either to the tenant with deductions made or transferred to the new owner. This sort of gets into a real question if the ownership transfers and the tenant doesn't get the money back when they move out of the contract, out of the lease. I really end up having to advise telling it, not having to, but I do tell them probably you're left suing both the old landlord and the new landlord because if you never got the letter saying it was transferred, if you never got the deposit back, you really don't know who has it. One of those two parties has it. So the most cautious thing to do is to bring them both to court and say, Your Honor, one of these guys has it. Tell whichever one has it to pay me. And that's what the judge can do. Um, Last, it's important to say the tenants cannot force the landlord to use the security deposit as last month's rent. This is sort of a finer point of law here, right? Yes, if a tenant moves out owing money, the landlord can keep the deposit for that rent, but that is not a credit that the tenant has prepaid in the form of the deposit is not a credit. They can't say, hey, use my deposit. I mean, look, they can, you can say anything, but if they do that, the landlord doesn't really have to. They can still be owed the money for that month's rent, plus pursue an extra penalty against a tenant. Again, this is sort of to combat tenants who would just say, "I paid you the deposit. See you later," right? So that's some extra penalties the landlord can pursue the tenant for. So why can a landlord deduct from the deposit? The key thing here, the biggest one is going to be damages. The landlord can deduct for damages that go beyond ordinary wear and tear. Um, this is, there's a lot of ideas inside ordinary wear and tear, right? What is ordinary? What is wear? What is tear? What is and? What's this and I'm hearing of, right? But the way I view it is that it is not the tenant's responsibility to return the property to how it was when they moved in. It's how it was when they moved in, plus ordinary wear and tear on top of that. That the sort of nicks and scratches and bumps and bruises that come with living in a property, that falls into the category of the cost of doing business. It's the damage that goes beyond that that the landlord can get the tenant can take money from the tenant for. Um, we see paint a lot. We see carpet a lot. And I think it's relevant to talk about sort of the useful life of some of these items. Um, I think about my car, right? It's 10 years old. It has 100,000 miles on it. If it gets sideswiped by a bus and destroyed, I don't get a brand new car. I get the value of what was destroyed, which is, well, look, it's got a CD player in it, which is pretty nice. You don't see that anymore, right? But so same with the carpet, right? The tenant moves in, the carpet is not new. They live there for 4 years. They move out. The landlord wants to say the carpet was trashed. Well, what was trashed? What is the value of what's left? Was this actually a 7 or 10 or 15-year-old carpet? Take paint, right? If the paint wasn't new when the tenant moved in, they lived there for 3 years. Well, things just need to be repainted. There's no requirement that a landlord needs to replace carpet or repaint between tenants. But at a certain point, it just needs to be done. And the stuff that needs to be done, the stuff that wears out over time, that's not the tenant's responsibility to pay. Landlord can also, oh, sorry, phew, landlords can also charge for a debt that's still owed. This again, unpaid rent, a utility bill that runs with the property. Those are things that the landlord can charge. Um, we did see and have seen sort of some automatic fees the landlords might charge, something like a $200 cleaning fee or a $200 carpet cleaning fee. I don't think a landlord can just charge money because they say they get to. They can charge it if it needs $200 worth of cleaning because it was dirty beyond ordinary wear and tear. But they can't just say, no matter the condition, we get to charge it. That really eviscerates the whole point of the statute if you can just like pick numbers out of the air and say you get them for no reason. So when does a deposit need to be returned? A couple things have to happen first. First, end of the tenancy, right? Tenant has no claim to the deposit until the tenancy is over. Once that happens, they have to give the landlord a forwarding address or delivery instructions for where to send the deposit. Once those two things have happened, the landlord has 21 days. 21 days to put it in the mail, either the money or an explanation saying why they're not getting all or part of the money. Again, that delivery instructions, that could be a future forwarding address, a PO box, a friend or relatives. There is a case from a long time ago where basically saying giving it to it was, I think it was from St. Paul. And so whenever I tell this story, the bar I always think of is like Halftime Rec. I don't know if anybody's ever been to Halftime Rec, but I always think of Halftime Rec as being the bar where the guy said this. But the tenant said, "Give it to Jimmy down at the bar and I'll pick it up from him." That was deemed to be good enough delivery instructions. So that happens once the landlord knows where to send it. Then the 21 days happen, and again, this is postmarked on the 21st day. It doesn't have to be in the tenant's hands, but postmarked on the 21st day. That's an important thing. So keep those envelopes. Um, if the landlord misses the deadline, there are some penalties. The tenant can sue for an amount equal to the wrongfully withheld deposit plus the deposit itself if the landlord misses the 21-day deadline. Tenant can always sue for an extra $500 in bad faith retention for sort of what the statute calls the willful and malicious withholding of the deposit. But that's really a big thing. If the money it's that 21 days and the court is awfully serious about it. Missing the 21 days doesn't close off the landlord's right to make deductions. I think that's a somewhat commonly held belief that missing the 21 days, the landlord forfeits their rights to collect. I think what it does is it entitles the tenant to the penalty equal to the wrongfully withheld amount, so that the landlord is starting essentially in the hole when they start making deductions. That's how I view it. But you get 3 attorneys in a room, you'll get 4 opinions. So there you go. So what about a simple problem here, right? We got $1,000 security deposit and tenant lives there for a year. They give the proper notice to move out. They give the forwarding instructions. The landlord misses the deadline. The tenant now can sue for an extra deposit equal to the wrongfully withheld amount. That would be the deposit plus interest. They can always sue for the bad faith retention. $1,000 deposit becomes a $2,520 claim. Plus court costs, another $75 for court costs. So this is a very important thing to pay attention to. I don't be cute, right? My advice to landlords here is don't be cute about the 21st day. If you know the numbers on day 18 or day 14 or day 3, send it out. I've seen landlords try to send it out on the 21st day, and maybe they missed the mail pickup that day. Maybe it waits until the weekend. What matters is the postmark. And if the pickup is at 3 and you drop it in at 3:15, hey, don't wait. Don't wait. Take care of business. That's my opinion. That's my advice.
All
All right.
right, so we are looking at 3 minutes early. Great timing there, Matt.
Yeah, thank you.
So we've got 9 questions in the Q&A, and then a few in the chat as well. So the order I'm going to do these in is the order they came in, and then Q&A, and then go back through the chat and answer ones we didn't answer. So the first question is, what happens if admin fees are added, but you're already locked into a lease?
Yeah, I think it's too late. I think everything that can be charged needs to be in the lease at the time of signing. That's the notion of the lease, is that what we're signing is what we agree to at this moment in time. And so I think it's really hard for a landlord or a tenant to say, yeah, the lease says this, but what we really meant is something else completely, especially in the case of fees. These fees are required to be disclosed in the advertisement. They're required to be on the lease in sort of this listing out fashion on the front page of the lease. And so if they were forgotten when it came time to write the lease, I don't think so. I think you forgot it. I think the offer is the offer and the acceptance is the acceptance. And that lease represents what was agreed upon.
All right, next question. What recourse or remedy does the tenant have that the unit was advertised at one price and after approval was increased by $15, making the tenant not able to afford the place? Tenant is on Section 8.
Yeah, I think that's going to be tough. I think maybe there's a fair housing claim somewhere tucked in there, alleging the landlord is somehow like shifting the goals, right? Shifting the goalpost, trying to perform some sort of bait and switch or something like that. The whole idea behind these statutes is that the advertised price is the offered price. That what we're giving, what we're showing, what we're offering, what we're advertising is in fact what we're offering. So then it's why is it different? Is it because the tenant is on Section 8? Is it some other reason that now all of a sudden it's changing? I'd be very skeptical of that landlord.
Yeah,
And
I'll just sort of jump in
yeah,
here for general market rate housing, right? If you're just out looking for housing on the open market, it is triple damages, right? So the $50, let's say over a 12-month lease, becomes $150 times the 12 months you could collect on.
yeah, I didn't talk about the damages. Yeah, for the bad fees.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. Next question. I'm assuming this is part of an application process, but can a landlord request tax records?
I don't know of anything that forbids it. I guess if the landlord's really looking for a real accurate depiction of a tenant's income, right? Yeah, the pay stubs, I've definitely heard of that, but I guess the tax records is a good indicator too. Um, for the tenant, some of this is sort of governed by these like vague market forces, right? At a certain point, a lot of tenants are going to say, this is intrusive. I don't want to apply here. And where does that leave the landlord, right? With no applicants that they may want. Now, is the market of that level right now where landlords will be left without applicants if they ask too much? I don't know. I don't know what it would take for the market to get to that point. But frankly, I don't know that I could find my tax records if someone asked for them. They're somewhere. I don't know what I assume they're around my house somewhere, but goodness, I'd have to dig. So I think they could. I just don't know how practical it is in the long term.
Yeah. So next question here. We've run into a situation where we're helping people apply to places where a lot of places are trying to find a tenant while the building is currently and actively on the market. We do catch it usually before lease signing, but it has happened at times where we didn't find out until it's too late. Do we have any recourse on that?
Oh, this is where like the landlord is trying to sell the building, and the tenant signs, not knowing the building's for sale. Um, Not really. The recourse, I guess, is that your lease is your lease. The new owner steps into the shoes of the old owner as far as any lease is concerned. That's not necessarily the remedy that you're looking for, right? Um, Especially, some landlords you build a rapport with, right? You have a relationship with, and you picked that building because it's that landlord, and you know that landlord is good and does his responsibilities. You don't know this other guy, right? You don't know this other company. So um yeah, the good news is the new owner can't just kick you out. Maybe the bad news is your lease is still your lease.
What if a tenant doesn't have any rental history because they're in their 30s and they have it and they've lived with their parents their entire lives? Or what recommendations do you have there?
I think it's just going to be about being upfront to say, look, I living with my parents to save money, um, and or whatever the reason is, right? And to say, if you've been paying them, you can say, look, I can show you that I've been paying them every month. Um, if you haven't been paying them, well, that's fine too. But I think it's just to be upfront about it and say, you're going to ask about rental history. So here's my rental history. Is this going to stop me from renting this place?
If a tenant can't work due to their disability and they don't have a good history, or if the tenant can only get stipend or like temporary work, how can credit history be used?
Um, I'm not sure how the disability laws would play into this. My feeling is that it wouldn't be is that the number is going to be the number in that situation. If the credit history, I think it's worth it to be able to explain why, right? To say, look, my credit score is going to be bad, my credit history is going to be bad. Here's what happened, and here's why I can afford this place, right? Here's why this place is going to work for me and work for you. I think this is an unsaid point, and a different way to look at it is that we talk about sort of tenants seeking out landlords for a place to rent, and that the tenant is looking and the tenant is wanting. But this goes both ways. The landlord needs something from the tenant also. And if the landlord had a tenant, they wouldn't be advertising. So they do need something, right? This isn't exactly a one-way street. There are probably more tenants looking at units than are available. And so the landlord can be a little picky. But also, I think it's worth just kind of keeping in mind that, look, the landlord wants something. What they want is a reason to say yes, right? And so do your best to give the landlord a reason to say yes. And that's going to be to say, here's what you'll find. Here's what happened. Here's why going forward, it's not a problem.
Yeah, one thing I will say on that, there's sort of two levels to it. So there's discrimination based on source of income, right? So if someone's only income is disability. I think that's statewide, right? You can't discriminate based on source of income.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So if that's the only reason they're denying that, that's a no-go in the state. But if it's purely because of a low credit score is not a protected class in the state, so they can deny purely on that. Does the late fee for rent include late fees or late payment on utilities or overdue utilities?
I think it's going to depend a little bit on how precisely the lease is written. And I think it's gonna depend on how the lease is written. What I'd be looking for is what is described as rent and who does the tenant pay the utilities to. Um, so that's my question is a full-throated. It depends. Philip, maybe you got.
Yeah, no, I think you're on the right track there, right? There's like, if you pay your electricity directly to Excel or whatever, right? Your landlord really doesn't care if that's late or not. That's kind of a contract between you and the utility company. But if the utilities are billed through your landlord, I think they can impose a late fee on that overdue utility bill as long as they disclose it. Um, can a landlord or property manager charge for damaged shades that was the fault of the maintenance person?
Oh, that's a really good question. I mean, yeah, who caused the damage is a relevant question in a security deposit dispute. And any sort of damage question, who caused it, is very much a legitimate question. So, yeah, maintenance man broke it. Now landlord's trying to charge you. No, I think so. I think that's grounds to go to small claims court. Fight that one out.
Yeah, great. Last question for the Q&A, and then we'll get into chat questions. So we are a housing support program, and we had a client pass away. When we notified the landlord, they said they needed an official death certificate from the county, and that is when the 60-day notice would start. They expected the client's estate to be liable for the 2-month payment. Have you seen this happen, and how do you go about handling this?
Yeah, the death of a tenant is a real difficult situation, as is the death of a landlord. The death of anybody is a terrible situation. So let me try to think of what the statute is. This is a good statute. It's not one I know off the top of my head. I haven't been doing my flashcards, so I can't be like, oh, death of a tenant, 504B1. I don't know what I have been
Yeah,
doing my flashcards. Um, but I think the statute says what the tenant would need, what the not the tenant, what the tenant's estate or the tenant's personal representative would need to show for that to trigger the statute. And oh, here it is, 265, 265. Um, well, the tenant's estate may terminate the lease. So the tenant's estate, would that need to be have a open probate action to be deemed the estate? Look, so this is where I cut through the difficult questions and go to sort of the end result question here, right? Um, if the landlord wants to make a claim for money owed, they need to file a claim against the deceased's estate. Um, will there be anything to collect? I don't know. There is going to be some sort of exemption for homestead property. Most people, when they die, their main asset is the home that they own. If they're renting, maybe they don't have a home that they own, right? Um, life insurance tends to pass outside the probate process, right? Um, my any sort of debt that's owed is mostly owed by the estate rather than the heirs themselves. And so my advice a lot of times to a personal representative in this situation would be to say, what we've given you is enough. You know the tenant is dead, and remove the property as fast as you can.
yeah,
That's a lot of times my answer.
yeah. Yeah, I think you're on the right track there, right? The statute doesn't say anything about a death certificate is part of the notice. It just says notice has to be provided.
Yeah.
And it's going to take a couple weeks for the county to get the death certificate together, get notarized, yada yada yada. So to me, notice is notice. There's no requirement it has to be an official government document saying the notice. So the 60 days should start on the date they were notified rather than when the death certificate gets issued. But they are within the law to charge the 2 months rent.
Yeah. Yep.
Um, all right, that is our Q&A questions. If anyone has them, we'll be here for a little bit longer, but we're going to go into chat questions. So the first one we have is there a grace period for late fees?
Not under statute. A lot of leases I see will have a grace period where they don't kick in until the 5th. But certainly under a lease, they could come into effect on the 2nd if that's what the lease says.
Last question we have here. How do you generally see security deposits handled in mutual termination agreements in both non-payment and non-payment eviction actions? Or sorry, non-payment and not non-payment eviction actions.
Okay. Yeah. So for a tenant negotiating an early termination of the contract, so this is something that can happen a lot, right? Like I said earlier, contracts are agreements between parties. They are both enforceable, but can also be changed if everybody agrees to it. And sometimes the lease it's just not working out. Maybe it can be for a lot of different reasons. And so sometimes a tenant would want out of the lease. A landlord would want the tenant to stay. Sometimes the landlord wants a tenant to stay. Vice versa, tenant wants a tenant out. Tenant wants to stay. All right, who wants it? Who wants the other? Who wants the lease ended more? It depends on who's going to pay, right? And when it comes to paying, a security deposit can certainly be part of the negotiation procedure, right? We have this thing of value. We can negotiate over it, and it can be if a tenant wants to end the lease, they could say, hey, look, it is June 18th. Why don't I move out on July 31st? I'll pay you July's rent. You keep my security deposit. I'll leave the place in good shape. And we're done, right? For a landlord, that might be a good enough deal. It's 6 weeks from now. That's time to find a new tenant. If they can't, they've got that insurance policy of the security deposit. The important thing is to get it all in writing. Anytime you've got a written contract and you want to change that contract, you need to have it in writing because the writing is what matters. That's the magic of it, right? So I think it's fine to use it as sort of a negotiating bargaining chip. When it comes to a situation for non-payment of rent, look, the landlord, if money is owed, the landlord can keep the deposit. So there's not a lot for the landlord to want to negotiate over that deposit because the money's owed and I've got this money, so I can keep it. That's sort of my thoughts there. I'm happy to expand on it more if I missed sort of the real gist of the question.
No, I think that's a good answer. And that is our last question. So we are at 2:45 here. We can give people 15 minutes of their day back.
Yeah.
Yeah, as a quick preview, so next month's webinar is going to be on evictions, updates to statistics, and then talking through sort of eviction procedure and what that looks like. We'll have the date for that on our website here soon, and then our newsletter coming up. So thank you everyone for attending, and have a good rest of your day.
Yeah.